Now we can get started, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you also for being here online. Benjamin, welcome also to you. We know it's very early for you, but we are very happy to have you on board. We are here with many students and scholars, and we have this roundtable now, this webinar from the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, which is led by Dr. Wassenberg at the University of Strasbourg. And the topic that we will discuss today is the narratives on borders in time of crisis, and we will have the chance to have a comparative perspective from the border Canada-US and from Europe, and especially the Franco-German border. Let me maybe present myself. I'm Devne, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this webinar. I'm working at the Euro Institute in Quelle. It's a cross-border institute specialized in cross-border cooperation and in building capacities for cross-border cooperation. And I'm working a lot with Dr. Wassenberg from a very long time. I'm also a member of this Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and that's why it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. And so in order to introduce maybe briefly the topic, narratives on borders in time of crisis. Well, crisis, this is not new anymore. There have been many crises in the last decades, going from terrorism, migrant crisis, COVID, of course, but also the Ukraine-Russia war, or now the Israel-Gaza conflict. So we see like an acceleration in the crisis occurring now in our world, and it is important to look in when a crisis occurs also at the borders, because there are some narratives going around borders when a crisis occurs, and we will maybe ask ourselves, what is the role of borders, or what happens at borders when a crisis occurs? And to reflect on this, I have the pleasure to have this great panel around me, and you will see that I think we have the best experts ever in order to discuss these questions, and this for many reasons. First of all, I welcome here Laurie Trotman. She comes from the Western Washington University in the West. I welcome also Emmanuel Bunejaï from the University of Victoria in Canada, and Frédéric Béraud from the University of Strasbourg, and also Dr. Wassenberg from the University of Strasbourg also. Why are those four persons the best persons? This is because, as I said in the introduction, we will have a look at a perspective between Canada, US, and Franco-German. And you have one person coming from Canada, Emmanuel, one person coming from the US, Laurie. And for the European part, you have two professors of Sciences Po Strasbourg, but one is French and the other is German. So you will have also this geographical perspective, national perspective maybe. And then also because if we want to look at this question on narrative on borders in times of crisis, you will have to get an insight from different perspectives, also interdisciplinary perspective. And this is why it is also very important to have a geographer, Laurie, to have a political scientist, Emmanuel, to have a lawyer, Fred, and to have also an historian, Justin. So I think it's a perfect mix. And so I'm very happy to have the discussion with those four experts. And maybe my first question to all the panelists would be that when a crisis occurs, at least in the last decade, I have always the impression that the border or the other on the other side of the border is the problem. Do you feel also like this, that always the focus is on the border, and this is where the problems are, and where maybe we want to just close things in order to just have a look at our part of the borderlands? Do you have also the impression? And if you have this impression also, do you think it's a reality, or can we make it another way around? I don't know who wants to start for this. Maybe we can start with our to go and over the Atlantic, and to start with Emmanuel.
So I think that the whole issue is the construction of the other. I think it's because sometimes on the other side of the border you have family members. You have people who speak the same language. They come from the same ethnic background and religious background that you have. And so the border is kind of very big, at least for the borderlanders, for people who live. And then you have this imposition from the center of the government. The government with Ottawa, Vancouver is about 4,500 kilometers, longer than the Madrid to Russia to Moscow. So that's the spectrum is very big, right? So that's one aspect, is the construction of the other. Sometimes the border is really located in a place where there is a need cut the land, to partition the land. And we know that they are placed in the verb, for instance, in Europe. Think about Belfast, where you have walls that are 6 feet high, for religious reasons primarily, right? But also because of old colonial peasants, right? The fact that Scots and English have moved into this area of Ireland and have occupied the land and acquired it. And on roots and sometimes on border. So that's also an illustration of what that's happening in one can be. So there is two aspects to the question. And then, sorry, we can have much more, I guess, contemporary examples or less historical examples that are more about a sudden crisis, like the 9/11 example is a good one, because you have a security community that pre-exists, right? So what we see in Canada and the US, we have an attack in the US, in New York, right? And you see that most of the planes that were going to land at these airports, the airports that we're discussing, end up going to Canada. And that is because Canada and the US have an old security agreement, and there is very strong solidarity. It's important to remember that at the time, the headquarters of the military in the US for this agreement was staffed by Canadian generals. But the process that was followed would have been the same, because it's a process, because they trained to administer the security community if it had been the US. So it's quite interesting. In this case, in the case of the 9/11 horror, I guess, the interesting part, however, is that since then the border has hardened tremendously, and it has hardened in less than a generation than it was before. And people now tend to forget that prior to 9/11, a lot of people were able to cross the border just because they spoke the right kind of English. or never showed their papers. The border was open. Maybe you could really ask for a credit card or for some kind of ID, but you didn't need a passport if you were a resident of the border region. And I experienced this myself firsthand when I was doing interview work in the Niagara region with a friend of mine whose father worked in Buffalo, but they resided on the other side in Niagara. And so it's kind of interesting that you could have that in a way very soft understanding that the borderlanders can go back and unchecked. Today, borderlanders may have enhanced driver's license, but in many cases they are checked. There are mechanisms today that use biometric standards that allow you to, in a way, cross the border before you reach the boundary line, cross the border before you pass the border post or the border gate. And Laurie can discuss this because she's actually the holder of one of those. And so for borderlanders, once you are in the system, it makes the border almost completely transparent. But the very big difference is that the border gates post 9/11 have been strengthened and have been loaded with technology and also staff. And the number of staff on the Canada-US border has been enhanced tremendously. Then the last point I want to make is about COVID. When COVID happened, it's extremely interesting to look at, in a way, the state of disarray that it created across the European Union and other states that were unprepared for such a pandemic, across the North American state system as well. But what I want to point to is something that happened specifically in France, is that suddenly it was not just state-to-state borders, but it was also your neighborhood and having the right to move outside of the neighborhood. There is a report from the European Parliament on this point that is quite striking or really interesting in many ways, because suddenly the international boundary line is in a way demultiplied and people are kept in their neighborhoods and can't really travel unless they have the right to do so, or they have letters of authority. And so the construction of the algorithm there is quite interesting. It is that it's nearly impossible to know who the other is. So it just works from a very predetermined perspective, right? The other is anybody. And so it creates a system where it's extremely difficult to know. In British Columbia, the approach was very different. But there was a point before the vaccination whereby people would basically never, ever cross the 6 feet line, right? So it was, you could go and meet friends, but you would never cross the 6 feet line. You avoided to cross the 6 feet line with people on the street if you walk, and certainly in shops, you never ever cross the 6 feet line. There was a controversy, and I wrote a couple of papers on COVID, I think 3 or 4, but one specifically about the wearing of masks during COVID, which I thought was extremely interesting because in Canada, the wearing of masks was illegal in certain provinces until about the time of COVID. There were court cases as late as 2019 in Quebec, where bus drivers were actually required to take it down. Right? They were asked by law, by the court, to not wear a mask as late as 2019. And so it's quite interesting to see that the reintroduction of the mask was really something that was, in a way, counterintuitive in Canada, because lots of people had, in a way, internalized the fact that it's just not a thing to do. You just don't wear a mask, you show your face. If you don't show your face, you're basically not a very good citizen. And so that construction of the algorithm is kind of bizarre within Canada. But it came very progressively, I guess, in the fall 2020, that the medical officer in general, the chief of the medical policies for the province of British Columbia, came on camera and asked people to stop wearing masks, not only to respect the 6 feet line, which was actually policy across all the shops. So, you had markers on the floors, in shops, in corridors, at the university, we had markers on the floor, and so on and so forth. Reminded people all the time that you have to never cross that 6 feet line. But at the same time, and I remember watching a show where she explained that she could do an interview because they were far away from her, and it was totally safe to actually have a discussion to decide what's from her. And at the same time, a few months later, she actually does a show again. She had an hour every single week. She basically wrote reports and discussed policies in public. It's on YouTube, by the way, if you're interested. And she introduces the idea of wearing a mask with the research behind it and why it's a good idea. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting at the time is that when you wear a mask, you protect others, but you don't protect yourself from others, which is still something a little bit controversial in Canada, but it's a very important aspect of what she was trying to distill in the public. So see these 4 different perspectives. I think the construction of the other is very complex and not resolved.
Well, thank you for this very interesting insight. And now we will have a look at the other, on the other side of the border with Laurie. And yeah, I will ask you exactly the same question. Is the border or the other the problem?
Well, I think to answer your question, in times of crisis and this sort of othering process that the border enables, I mean, certainly depends a little bit on the crisis, right? But I think during crises, people are scared and they want to feel protected. And I think the border is a pretty swift and fairly easy policy response for governments to enact. It's also a very visible way, sort of political theater to say, we're closing the border, we're protecting you from people on the other side, because it is a filtering process. So whether it's terrorism or security or the pandemic, the border can sort of play this gatekeeping role. And I guess I'll get back to the other in a second, but I do think that the important piece there is you are putting people on the other side, right? They are the other, but the border is really playing the role of being in place to adequate policy responses. And we saw that absolutely during the pandemic, where did closing our borders prevent infection from entering the United States? Did it prevent every single variant of concern from entering the United States or Canada? No. We all ended up pretty much seeing the spread of this regardless of what our border policy looks like. It's the same with drug smuggling and terrorism in the United States. I mean, we have these incredibly expensive, incredibly destructive policies at the border, and they've done very little. I mean, it's a little hard to measure if it doesn't happen, right? But we still have terrorism incidents. We still have massive drug importation. It's a little bit like we saw our colleague David Newman present on the fence with Gaza, between Gaza and Israel, and he gave this example of how incredibly expensive this fence was, and how it had concrete pillars that were way underground and these huge barbed wire contraptions. And in the end, people found ways to get over it. They find ways to get across these borders. So, I think the borders are a way to intentionally place the other on the other side to make everybody who's inside feel safe. And maybe to counter that, I would say, I think that's not how people feel in borderland communities. As Emmanuel mentioned, there's a lot of families that straddle those borders. There's a lot of dual citizens that have to, obviously are relating to people on the other side. There's also the economics of borderlands, where you have people who run businesses that depend on people coming from the other side, or they may be commuting to the other side for work. So I guess I would say that the othering process around borders, I think is, I don't want to say it's a natural tendency, but I think it's sort of a reactionary tendency, and it's in the borderlands where perhaps we can counter that narrative because we do know each other and we do trust each other. So,
Thank you so much, and I will come to some of your points a little bit later again. But first of all, I would like to move again to Europe and maybe ask the same question to Frédéric Devaux.
Maybe my answer would be to distinguish between crises, because I don't think that every crisis border controls or border as if we look in the different crises faced by Europe, the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, a very important one, but it was not a question of border. The question of one member state to control and to impose a certain number of to stabilize the Eurozone. The problem was not the border, it was a question of stabilization, which is the very definition of crisis. Crisis and stable moment, stable process, and then you need to go back to of balance. If you take, on the other hand, the sanitary crisis or the energy crisis, for Ukraine, I would say that this type of crisis is different because you have a feeling of danger, yourself, and then if you are in danger, you need protection. And I think there is a second, for me, a second criteria, which is the question of sovereignty. Borders are interesting when sovereignty is at stake, national sovereignty is at stake. Either because, and we have seen it very concretely during the sanitary crisis, the sanitary policies are of the competence of the member states, not of the European Union. So then you go back to national confidence and national actions, and it's the same for energy crisis. The idea is that you have to protect people so that they can have electricity and heating. So of course the crisis is different in winter and in summer, which was very obvious for us for this last year. And maybe also something which was quite surprising to me is that with the pandemic, the crisis was particular because we had no pharmaceutical. We don't have any and at that time, no vaccination. And at that time, vaccination seemed to be, in a very long time. Normally, 10 years for develop a vaccine, and then it was quicker because it was a sort of general mobilization to find a solution. In a lot of modern but when you don't have any virus control, you don't know how to cure people, you don't know how really to react. I remember when it was the case in the hospital in Strasbourg, people were dying in the hospital, not even in the room. So it was panic. And I think that we also, because of this fear, because sometimes something had to be done. So if it's not possible to propose treatment, if it's not possible to save people at the hospital, then the only thing you can do is the lockdown. And the lockdown, you go back to the Antiquity, go back to the Middle Ages, and it's the same vocabulary. Which has been used in maritime, for example. It was not the proper term because it was not 40 days, but most of the time 10 or 15 days, but the technique was the same. And I think that maybe because of this sort of antique solutions that we had to defend or to try to rediscover, then borders have a sort of mythical signification, and at least if I see the problem at the level of a member state, at least if you do something with border, you choose something. And even if you know that it is not completely efficient, it was not completely inefficient. Because if you are locked down in Strasbourg, it's pretty normal that you don't cross the border. If I can't go from my home to the university because it's far away, then it's quite normal that you have problems at borders. So I think that's also this kind of unilateral reaction handed by each member state, which led to this blockage that we faced at least during the sanctions. That's my first thought.
Thank you so much, Frédéric, and you made the perfect transition to Birte, talking about going back to the Middle Ages and have this historical perspective. Maybe, Birte, you want to add something?
I don't want to go back to the Middle Ages, but I would like to give a historical response. And I think actually the reflex that we mentioned, I think we all agree on. And in crisis, you're afraid, and the national states, and that's across the Atlantic or in Europe, the same reflex is, we put back the national border. But in Europe, borders, and now I quote Alfred Moser from 1958, not from the Middle Ages, but he said the border is a star of history. And especially in Europe, when you go to the borders, there have been many conflicts between people from this side and the other side of the border. So when you put an emphasis on that border, again, by wanting to protect your population from a virus or a terrorist attack, then you risk that the othering will come back historical conflicts that seem to have been overcome. And the two examples, the first example we had today in the working group was Ireland, Northern Ireland, the othering, Protestants against Catholics, question on Northern Ireland, the unification of the Isle of Ireland, etc. All this comes back again when you, in the crisis of Brexit, back at border, community border, making the border visible again, or at this border, France-Germany, when you put back the border, all of a sudden, and this was a real surprise in the COVID crisis, when the Alsatian cross-border workers were suddenly attacked by the Germans as being the nasty coronavirus, the nasty French, and they threw tomatoes against their cars. And so we call this ressentiment. And it's very dangerous because it leads to othering and to mental borders, which are difficult to overcome. But I also agree with Frédéric when she says that you have to be careful and consider each crisis, because when I look, for example, at the migration crisis, we also had a presentation on migration crisis. The othering then was, there were also a closure of borders to avoid income of migrants, but then the othering is not between French and Germans, but in Europe it was more against othering in terms of racism against Syrians, dark colors. So at the borders you could see racism. That's a different type of othering that happens following a rebordering process.
Well, thank you so much. If I pick a little bit of some of the points that were really interesting to me, many points were very interesting, but I very much like the idea of reflecting the construction of the other, like Emmanuel said, and also reflecting on the fact that the construction of oneself is also always evolving, and for the other, it's very complicated to follow. With the example of the mask, I found it very interesting also, because for the other, it would have been very difficult maybe to follow this internal discussion and to understand it. I also very much like the word that Laurie and Emmanuel used, borderlanders. I don't think there is a word in French or in German for this, and I like it very much, because really you mentioned that borderlanders don't feel like that, don't feel like there is a danger in the border, and don't fear maybe the other, like maybe someone who is much more away from the border. And yeah, in French or in German have commuters as a word, but we don't have this cross-border citizens, this idea, so to say. So I found it very interesting also because I think it has an impact on how we feel about the people who live in those spaces. And what Frédéric mentioned is, well, she mentioned a lot of things, but she was always also thinking of the national states, but also in the EU, or how the EU interconnect potentially with national states, and also this idea of the border being something a little bit mystical then. And this was deepened a little bit with the idea of mental borders by Berthe, and the idea of the othering. And this all leads me to my second question, because indeed, I think at least coming from a European context, my question is maybe much more European oriented, but I think the idea of the European integration is much more to demystify the border and to create much more integration. And the COVID pandemic shows how interlinked things were in borderlands, which was maybe not well known within national state, but it was one step more in order to say, well, we need more integration. And so my question was simply, but also difficult, what should the states or the administrations, local or regional, do or say in order to demystify or normalize the border, or it is even possible? And maybe because my question is much more linked, I think, with the European context, and we'll start with Europe this time. And Berthe, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether in the European integration we have demystified the border. In fact, I have, so I contest this affirmation, because I myself have actually been dealing a lot with this question of Europe without borders. That's a narrative, it's our shares on European integration, and it's another mystification of the border, or idealization of the border having disappeared, which I think is not true. Not all borders have disappeared. So there's a kind of different idealization or mystification of the border. So what can states do to? So what do you mean by normalizing? So what's a normal border? That's another question I would ask there. In fact, what we have said in the last response is that the states used the border to protect the citizens from crisis, and I think this is a very classical or traditional response, which is probably no longer adapted to the reality of globalization, but also to the reality of European integration. And probably by closing the border unilaterally, you have also experienced it. We have experienced it here in our border region. The states have done more wrong than good by making people believe that the virus comes definitely from the other side of the border, and the Germans thought it was the French, or vice versa. And so I think what you should do is maybe to, and I'm not the best specialist for this, but to not demystify the border, but to define the border in all its complexity, and to say, okay, there are different types of borders. What borders are we talking about? State borders, political borders, administrative borders, cultural borders, social borders. What borders do we mean? And what functions of the borders we want? And with which objectives? Do we want a Europe without borders for mobility? But then how do we provide security with regard to the COVID crisis, because we're talking about crisis? If we want to protect the citizens by closing borders, maybe we don't control the passport, because the passport doesn't show the virus unless it is the vaccination passport, which is different, but we have to use sanitary criteria. So in fact, it means what the states and the local and regional authorities can do is to look at the border from all its sides or its functions, and see how we can best use it in a functional way for the purpose that we want, either to make it a little bit more hermetic or less hermetic, or to use it as a filtration, or And then the second element, maybe, and I'll finish with this, is to, and this is specifically also the case for Europe, because we have discovered with the COVID crisis that it is necessary to have multi-level approach to the border management, meaning that we need the European level to intervene, maybe coordinate openings and closures of borders on the European level. To avoid that we have n'importe quoi in the European context, and then but we also need the national levels, because they are, for the state borders, the authority to deal with the to manage the borders, and then we also need the local and regional level in the borderlands for the borderlanders to be able to see, well, what can we do. Or when do we, if we close the border, well, how can we do make sure that the cross-border workers can still go from one side to the other, that we have these specific mobilities being put into place.
Thank you for this. And maybe with this multilateral governance, also the idea of respect between the multi-levels, not a top-down, but also bottom-up. But thank you for this insight. Maybe, Frédéric, you want to add something from the European perspective?
I will try to answer your question considering the action of the participated, it began just before the COVID, research on the narratives of the court of justice. My first contribution about borders, and the title was non-dit or non-lieu. Because if you consider the European Union, first, they never spoke at that time, they never spoke about borders. A little bit about external borders, a little bit of state borders, but because it's borders which are equivalent to national borders, but the internal borders of the inside the European Union, it was something which was not said, maybe because it had to disappear. And it was a non-lieu because on many internal borders, architecture disappeared. You didn't really have the feeling of crossing the border unless maybe you are mobile, there's then change of operator, and sometimes the landscape is a bit different, language is different. Stop, you don't know really where is the border. If you go by train from Paris to Brussels, you don't know where is the border. And I think that it has been the sanitary crisis played a shock for the European Union, because they have been obliged in March 2020 to explain to the member states how they can close borders, which was the opposite of the DNA of the. And I think that we entered into a process of normalization of borders as spaces which have to be managed by the European Union. And managed because, as you had said, Laura, it's a question of how do you filter goods, people, services, capitals. And as you said, Emmanuel, one of the things we have discovered also with crisis, migration crisis, but also with sanitary crisis, is that we were not prepared for this type of crisis. And one of the things we clearly see at the level of the European Union is that, and that's a very important dimension of resilience, the question of preparation, anticipation, and trying to define a certain number of procedures for normal times, but also for times of crisis, so that at least we know how to coordinate actions at the level of borders to avoid the blockage faced within Europe. And I think that this question of a specific governance of borders within the European Union, the internal and external borders of the European Union, is more and more important if we study the text adopted by the European Union in 2021. this is quite clear. We have many texts. And I just want to remind also something we 3 weeks ago at the University of Strasbourg, which was the knowing exercise. The knowing exercise, knowing for numerous victims. So the idea was that more than 100 students, staff have been attacked and wounded at the university. And it was an exercise with the prefecture, the police, firemen, observers from the German side, journalists, and the government of the university. And what was surprising to me, I was at the level of the university, was that for many, many things, we don't know what to do because we never have asked the question. So you don't know how to communicate. You don't know who you have to who you have to phone. Is it possible to phone? What do you answer to the journalists? What do you answer to the families? What do you answer to the staff? This is completely. It was really very interesting exercise because we were obliged to play the game, and it was the same for the police and for the firemen, because for them it was very complicated because the campus is an open space, and with this type of crisis, in fact, we are not prepared, and it's very difficult to react. But it is the only way to be able to react in a coordinated way and not in a unilateral way, which according to me, the catch. So I think that the two keywords we use for this preparation to crisis is planification, and it's quite counterintuitive for both planification, it's not liberalization, and centralization, which is also something that is not completely the of the European Union. Centralization of information, centralization of a certain number of stocks, and so on and so forth. So I think that this normalization of borders is something which is very important to happen.
Thank you so much. And now I will suggest to move on the other side of the Atlantic and see how you can see this from a US perspective, Laurie.
Well, I suppose I think of very traditional terms when I think of borders, and it's federal governments and the international border between the two states. And so your question, which was sort of what would be the role of the state in demystifying the border, if we're thinking about the federal governments, I would say that's absolutely not the role, right? Because we tend to not reflect some of the decisions that are made by our legislators that are far away from the border. We'll be talking about COVID for years and years, but this was a great example of how these decisions that were made to close borders had such a huge impact on border residents, borderlanders, and a lot of trust was completely eroded in federal governments. And I guess that's sort of what gets back to multi-level governance. And certainly the idea that you've got elected officials at the regional or the local level, that's where I think you can really make relationships of trust that are ongoing. And perhaps the important thing is that those are well established and they're intentional and they're not being sort of erected during a time of crisis. It was Julia earlier who said, you have to know who to call before a crisis happens, because if you don't know who that is when the crisis happens, you're not going to figure it out very easily. So I think those relationships of trust and just familiarity that happen at the local level are probably the best way of sort of demystifying the border. And whether that's in regards to a function of security or a function of the sanitary crisis has been mentioned. I think civil society is probably our best promise for demystifying.
Thank you so much also for this insight, and maybe Emmanuel, you want to comment on this?
So I think that we have two questions demystify and normalize. I think, and I'm going to pick up on what Laurie said a little bit, but to demystify, we have to be aware of the fact that one's identity, because we were discussing the construction of the other, the construction of the other is and we do it at the individual level, but we also do this at the community level, the level of families, and so on. So as you are exposed to diverse kind of people, you're also exposed to similar kind of people. So the whole act of construction of the other is something that comes in a way naturally, but with many hesitation to most human beings. We all tend to construct up oneself from the perspective of our own family and our own immediate surroundings. And I would call this a process that can lead to very specific form of community building, but also of nationalism, right? And the whole idea of the nation can be a very small nation. Think about the Icelanders, they're a very small nation, extremely strong culturally, 300,000 people in the world. They speak the same language, they have a very specific form of religion as well, which is a form of vegetarianism, but extremely progressive. And also, they tend to think that they all look the same and they all are the same family. It's kind of interesting to do this. So the construction of oneself is, in a way, the first stone. But then the link between that construction of nationalism and cosmopolitanism is something that we are always, we tend to forget. So the COVID crisis for me is a really good example of how for us as human beings, and I wrote a paper on this during COVID, are confronted with their cosmopolitan position in nature. Because we're not the only human beings, we're not the only beings on Earth. And we are reminded when there is a virus like COVID that there are other kinds of beings that can wipe us out. They basically expand a bit too suddenly. And we tend to forget that cosmopolitan position. And I would say that a lot of cultures are either adverse to the idea of cosmopolitanism or embrace it with care. But certainly, when I think about educational system, when I think about Canada-US relations, when I think about how my own kids have gone to school in Canada and learned construction of the American, to differentiate between what is the United States and what is Mexico, what is a Mexican, what is a US citizen, what is a citizen. I would say that at least in Canada, provincial educational policies have not given enough thought to the construction of the island. And then it bites us back, obviously, because that thing that Laurie just discussed, the construction of trust, is actually ignored. It's actually not built into the education system. It's not built into the construction of one side. So, in academia, we bridge all of this without thinking because we work with people from all over the world. Because we can, because we speak many languages, because it's kind of a necessity for the profession. We learn what's going on in the world, and so we work really widely and we learn to work fast. But for many people in their profession, that's not a given. So the role of the state here for me, in a way, in many instances, and I'm talking about a public common good, which is education, right, is extremely important and always ignored. And that is the construction of the self in relationship to, identity, nationalism, and cosmopolitanism. And I think at the EU level, even though there are EU policies such as, the Army Peace Program, and that, people can go from one country to the other, there has not been enough work done in this context, specifically at the EU level, despite all of the grants that are going into this. 8 billion per program. I think it's quite significant. It certainly is overwhelming when you think of it, at least from a Canadian or even US perspective, right? Because this is, the amount of money that we're talking about is massive. It just overwhelms other countries completely. I would say there is a lot of lack of thinking here in the US. And then I'll come back to the idea of normalization. I see in border security, so Laurie has been part of a project whereby we studied security regions between Canada and the US, but also the security of regions across borders, so to speak, in 7 regions of the world. So we looked at every single continent and we looked at how border security regimes basically had emerged. How the EU constructed its border security, how the North American system, how Latin America, how Africa, how Australia, how Asia, and so on and so forth. Right? We looked at this data. But we also looked at each one of the Canadian regions that are kind of defined by geography. So we started with the corridor on the West Coast, then we moved to the, you probably know the geography enough that you can follow my line of thoughts, but we started with the West Coast, which is a corridor between, you know, the Alpine, if you want, ridge that goes from Alaska all the way down to Chile. Then you have that Alpine ridge, and then you've got a plain, completely flat for hundreds of miles. And then you've got vast forests and lakes, thousands of lakes, right, that cut across the land. And then you've got the Atlantic regions and the Arctic. And one thing that we discovered, and we're talking about one of the primary functions of state, which is provide security, as you can see in the case of Israel or Ukraine, is the very important function of state. What we discovered is that contrary to what states both on the US and on the Canadian side assume, unilateral policies do not work. Completely counterintuitive, right? Because people in Ottawa and people in Washington DC, they have so much money and staff that are all trained the same way, that obviously security policies in Cascadia, across the Rockies, across the prairies, across the Great Lakes, in the Atlantic regions or in the Arctic are all the same and follow the same standards, and they're all as efficient. And what we discover is that is absolutely not the case. That every single region is different. Another reason to think that even when you're thinking about, you know, this idea of uniform ET and the ability that the states will have to actually implement these policies is completely fair. Completely fair. And so I'm quite surprised, you know, when I mean, these were things that I even have to fight over on my team, right? The colleagues who are the lead editors for this refused to engage with the hypothesis that we would find different policies in governance of security across the Canada and US. We don't even have 2 chapters that are the same. And the prime reason is either the socio-economic or the economy or the relationships vary from one region to the other. And so the idea of the normalization has to take into account the uniqueness, the singularity of each socio-economic relation, or each kind of relation, each kind of trading relationship across these different parts of the world. So I think normalization is also something that, you know, when we're looking at the construction of these policies by state actors, they are just completely wrong approaches. We are not in the 19th century. Today, we have enough sophisticated research to know that so much more should be done, and the policies are just not sophisticated enough. They think, you know, you can mold out of clay one system for 7 relationships, and that's not the case. It doesn't. So they, in both, you know, the work of the demystification and normalization, I think what we see and what we observe in border regions and border studies is that the state has failed because it doesn't understand its borderlands and it doesn't understand the people who live in those lands. And it keeps ignoring this almost as if it was blind. Yet the research is there.
Well, thank you for those contributions to this question. I just put some key words from your statements together, and I very much like the idea of having the multi-dimension approach of the border. Think about multi-level governance also. Also bring the word coordination, planification, centralization together and think about it. Of course, the word trust, the role of civil society also, the word cosmopolitanism or education. And I just wanted to put all those keywords together again in order for us maybe to reflect on this afterwards. But for me, they were very important also in the discussion. And what I very much liked is also what the example that you took, Frédéric, from this security exercise at the university, and you also, Emmanuel, mentioning that, yeah, thinking unilateral does not work. And we've proven that through many cases. And I was wondering if one of the role of the state or the administration is not to know who you have to phone or who you have to contact, or understand a little bit more the system of the other, or know where to phone in order to have this answer. This is, of course, very familiar to me because this is also the role of the Your Institute, what we are doing. So we try to work in this perspective, but still, I think it's fundamental to have this knowledge or this open-mindedness in order to know where to get this knowledge, how you can figure it out, who is your the person you need for finding a solution for concrete problems. And this leads me also to my next questions. And just to know if you have one example or one project or one public policy where you can see there has been, during the crisis or as a consequence of the crisis, a good, at least, cooperation when not a collaboration. I refer there to the presentation of Laurie yesterday, who mentioned also 3 levels of working together, and the cooperation and the collaboration being the 2 last more integrated way, collaboration being the most integrated. And we had a discussion at lunch yesterday. It is not that easy to find some example of collaboration. I don't know if you find one since our lunch discussion yesterday, but yes, I will come back to you then.
I'll be brief in describing them because I was thinking about it, the collaboration really being working toward a common goal in a way. And I have several, but the 2 that I think are maybe the most inspiring are driven by civil society, by citizens and residents who are impacted by the border. So one was a community, there's a community called Point Roberts, Washington, which is an exclave that's completely cut off by the Canada-US border, because when we drew part of that border, it's literally a line. It's followed 49 parallel latitude. So it cut off this tiny little piece of land from Canada and said, this is in the United States. So you can imagine what it was like for that community when the pandemic border restrictions were in place, because they were essentially trapped on this tiny little bit of land that had no other way of reaching the United States unless you had enough money to hire a private jet. So there was a little bit of movement, and there was sort of some exceptions made. It was incredibly difficult. But one thing this community had was a very low population, only around 1,200 people, a lot of older people, and Washington State and the U.S. as a whole was pretty advanced in our access to vaccines. And so we were well ahead in British Columbia. Our vaccination rates were quite high. And this little community called Point Roberts had something like a 95% vaccination rate quite early in the pandemic, well before British Columbia was even at probably 15%, something. And they had a lot of extra vaccines. And so they would invite their British Columbians who were able to cross the border. Some of them had to be dual citizens. Some of them maybe had to cross for essential reasons, but there was, like I said, a little bit of mobility. and they actually held vaccination clinics for Canadians to get vaccinated. And that's happened in other areas along the Canada-US border. We had some Indigenous communities that were vaccinated very quickly for health reasons, and then they found themselves with surplus vaccines, and they reached out to their counterparts on the Canadian side. And there was actually some situations where the border guards themselves would let people go back and forth so that the Canadians could have access to those vaccinations. So again, really driven from the bottom up, but an example of communities very much working together for a common goal, which is to be healthy and protected from the virus. And then one other example was a group called Faces of Advocacy, and this was a civil society organization that began during COVID. Really, it was families and loved ones who weren't able to cross the border, but they had relatives and loved ones on the other side. And pretty early on in the pandemic, they began to advocate the Canadian government to make exceptions to allow unmarried couples, extended family, and people for compassionate reasons to be able to enter Canada. And so this was a mix of Americans and Canadians who lived cross-border lives, had the same common goals in being able to see each other. And they were able to successfully lobby the Canadian government to make these exceptions. And those benefits obviously were felt by these people that were separated. Now, on the flip side, there was a US organization that tried to take that same model and lobby the US government to allow unmarried couples and others, family members, to enter the US from Canada, and they were not able to get exceptions. So it was asymmetric, but it was still people on both sides of the border collaborating and actually producing some meaningful policy change that helped to alleviate some of the separation.
Thank you so much, Lori. Vista, would you have also some examples?
Yeah, I will give you two examples. One is well known for the COVID crisis between France and Germany. It's when the border was closed and the French were more infected in Alsace, and they were transporting the heavily infected patients with the TGV 1,000 kilometers away from Marseille. Then there was a reaction on the political side from the minister president and the president of the region. They formed a working group, and they actually very quickly organized health transfer of patients to the German hospitals, which were empty at the time because they were not infected. So I think this was a very good example of cooperation. Let me give you another example, which I find a little bit more funny, but it's still going on. In fact, there is in between. It comes from Martin Camial, who comes from the Franco-Spanish border, and the Franco-Spanish border in the mountains. Due to COVID, they have closed also the border, and there are some passages that they have. In fact, the French prefect, had decided to block the route between two villages in the mountains, France and Spain, with a concrete block, and they put a block there, and then. And then COVID was kind of over, and the blocks of concrete stayed. And so what the two comments, they can't get it. What they do, they take a peteur, they take a big truck, and they take away this block. They open the door, they just put it away. The two comments, they put it away to the side. And so the prefect knows this, and so then they organize, because they have, I think, a monthly meeting or something, so they cross the border, and then so the prefect then lets it for 2 or 3 weeks be like this, and then it comes back. And the next month, the same thing happens, and this is still going on now. It's still going on. So it's also a funny story of resilience, and but also of cooperation, because of that concrete block. Every month, and on the state level, they are still not resolved the problem. So the prefect at one point is also obliged to put it back on the street.
And maybe also best practice, because knowing of that, I had a meeting with the Franco-Spanish actors, but on the Basque side, and they had exactly the same, because it seems to be a political will from the French state towards the Franco-Spanish border but they don't have such a citizens initiative. So maybe it could be also best practice then. But well, thank you for these two examples. And Emmanuel, do you have some concrete positive examples?
So I have some examples, but first I want to come back to this idea of coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. In the work that we've done on border security and border security across borders, we basically, in the introduction, we have a whole chapter where we basically explain the difference. And the idea is this: when you coordinate, you talk across the border. The idea of ordinating is just to take ideas into order and put them into an order. But it doesn't mean you do anything together. You're just communicating some priorities with the other side, right? So you coordinate. The idea of cooperate means that you may have some relationship that allows you to operate on both sides in a way that is complementary. And a very good example of cooperation is if you have border patrols. Think about this. You know that for a very long time on the Canada-US border, but it's the same in Europe. Patrols would patrol both sides of the border at the same time. Right? So you have patrols who are actually, and they go at the same time because they never talk to each other. So why would you patrol your side of the border at the same time as the other patrol, you know, the German side is also patrolling the border, because you don't trust the other side. You want to make sure that they're not corrupt and that, you know, nothing is going to happen under their supervision. Once you start cooperating, you actually have one side patrolling at a certain time and the other side patrols at a complementary time, so that the border is always being patrolled. Well, in the case of, for instance, road control, right, or trafficking control, at one point, and you know, it's the same for infrastructure. If you ever look at a map between Canada, between France and Belgium, for instance, you'll see, or Spain and Portugal, you see they parallel highways and all. The highways have been built at a certain time and they basically run along the number of highways that cross the border is very few. That started changing in the 1990s, so since you were born. But what my point is, it's very important to become aware of this kind of trust relationship and the cooperation of policies. And then there's the collaboration. When you start collaborating, you actually depend on the other side doing its work well. Your life depends on the other side doing the work well. That's collaboration. And so the question obviously is, how do you move from coordination to cooperation to collaboration? Well, in the Anglophone literature, and that includes, and when you look at security literature, Karl Dutch is one of the first international scholars, specialists from the 1950s, who basically says, he theoretically argues that you can only move from coordination to collaboration in security regimes if you share the same culture. Think about this, only French people who share the same culture can actually move across this. And so one of the things that I wanted, with Christian and other colleagues, I wanted to demonstrate with the book was that that cultural assumption obviously should be wrong in the case of the European Union. Can we demonstrate it? And I'm getting to my example. And I set the challenge, I said to Christian, because Christian obviously didn't, I mean, at the time we had this debate, we were talking 5 years ago. And he said, it's absolutely not, you cannot prove, because, you know, we know the intelligence community works according to culture. That's why, if you know about intelligence a little bit, I don't know how much you know about intelligence, but the Five Eyes are really well known to actually all speak English. There are 5 countries and they don't speak English, they're not part of the Five Eyes. And that is why you have a high level of interaction between the spying agencies from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Canada, because they all speak English. Canada has a problem because part of the Five Eyes staff actually speaks French. And I'm not joking, it's actually very serious. Well, the thing is, in the European Union, since the Treaty Group started in 1973 because of terrorism, the European Union states have collaborated on a number of issues. Yet they speak how many languages today? Can you remind me? Right? They speak way more than 2 languages. No, they speak more than 1 for sure, right? Because every single state has a different language. So the cultural assumption that you have to share language and the same culture to trust each other is obviously wrong. And so I asked my colleagues to do case studies on this. And you know what we discovered? We discovered that actually, if you regulate the process and if you all agree on a regulated process, you write down the process on how you actually go from coordination to cooperation to collaboration, you can actually develop processes that create a relationship of trust. But what is fundamental is, in a way, the administration of the process. Because you agree to train your staff the same way, you agree that if they go from one step to step 2 to step 3, they will go from one step 2 to step 3. They're not going to jump one step. You know, they follow the algorithm of intervention. And so then we asked others to do research on the integrated border management systems. Right? You probably know that the European Union policy on borders, the basic principle is called integrated border management system, and the integrated border management system is created inside the European Union across internal borders at first, was tested on external borders of the Union almost 20 years ago now with countries like Romania, which everybody knows are highly corrupt, right? I mean, I'm pushing the envelope here, obviously, provocative. But the point is that it is working in countries where it should not be working. And the processes worked extremely well. And I have a PhD student whose name is Jules, who has done a study of 85 integrated border management agreements within the European Union, in the internal borders of the European Union, with the external borders of the European Union, and between the European Union and other states such as Morocco, Mauritania, other states outside of Africa, Canada, and so on and so forth. And again, the relationship of trust emerges out of the process. So I think it's a really interesting finding, which, you know, is being published. I don't remember the book just came out, but it's like 6 weeks old or a month old. I mean, so actually, I don't know. So you have it again. And I was a bit wrong, so I had the thing is, it's really important to realize this. So culture doesn't work, language is wrong. But if you can administer the process, if you can agree on how to integrate, then it works. And you can really take foes, you know, as I was saying yesterday, and take them through a process. And it actually works. I mean, the best example, I think, is the fact that Jules has in the database, I think he's got 15 or 18 data sets, and he's filtered every single one of these IBMs, 85 of them. And every single time, there is not one exception. The move from coordination to cooperation is because of process, and the move from coordination to collaboration is because. But you know, the activities, when you look at what these partnerships are doing, is like in the thousands of different functions around security, right? They're also vastly different because with 85 examples, we've got hundreds of situations that vary from one to the other. They're all different. Every border region is different, but the process stays the same.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And last but not least, Frédéric. Would you like to?
I think I will take the example of language policy within the European Union, because it's also a sort of illustration of what has been said before. Since 1996, within the European Union, we tried first to develop coordination, exchange of information on national systems, national infrastructures, national choices on image. and cooperation through the internal market process, and the idea of creating trust between infrastructures, trust between operators, trust between national agencies, on the assumption that each member state can have the choice of its source of energy, of its energy mix. And this has been developed since 1996 quite regularly by some number of reports. And then you had the energy crisis in 2022. And all of a sudden, things which were not possible to be discussed between the member states have been discussed. The source of general improvisation, so to have stocks of gas in the winter to be able to. And what was quite striking is that in something like 2 or 3 months, it was possible to discuss solidarity at a regional level, very operational manner. It was, I don't think it was based on confidence, but on a sort of common perception of danger and urgency, because we had to find an urgent solution. And quite important if I take the Franco-German relationship, France and Germany agreed for a bilateral agreement so that France was able to send gas to Germany, and Germany was able to send electricity to France. And because of this system, we did not have any problems in France in December last year, because otherwise we would have been out of electricity. So I think it's quite a very concrete and important achievement, which was not possible before the crisis. And the second example is the example of this common approach for gas imports into the European Union. For the first time, you have a common system established by the European Union, and each member state can decide to participate or not, and to buy in common, as we have done for vaccines, buy gas in common. Which means that at the moment, more than 98% of the stocks of gas are full within the European Union, which was not possible just 1 year ago. 1 year ago, everybody said that it was not possible to have this kind of policy because we were too different and because we had this energy sovereignty, which was defended by member states. Of course, this question of energy sovereignty did not disappear, and it is a factor of great attention between France and Germany, because France would like to develop nuclear power, and Germany wants to develop all the types of gases such as hydrogen. You have behind the question of renewable, non-renewable energy, and so on and so forth. But what is interesting is that we discussed this Franco-German relationship, the field of energy, in September in the Senat in Paris. And what was the conclusion of our exchanges was that we want to have a proper collaboration between France and Germany. Each member state has to admit that it is for the member states to choose source of energy, to stop. And it's not, for example, it's not possible that Germany decide to close Fessenheim, which is part of the story of Fessenheim. And this is the, this sort of chacun ses soi in terms of resource and energy is the only basis we can have if we want to develop a common approach to renewable energy, to safe nuclear energy or safer nuclear energy, or to develop new resources such as technology. Otherwise, if you don't have this sort of préposé, then you have a constant mistrust between the two countries. And the result is that you take serious risks in terms of energy. So it was quite interesting to see these developments in less than 1 year in this very specific
Thank you so much for all this explanation and those examples, because I think it gives us a little bit more positive thinking about borders, also in terms of crisis. And now we have only a few minutes left for the last questions. But the idea of my last question was to say, well, nowadays, as I said just at the beginning, there is a sort of acceleration of crisis in our even more globalized world, and maybe in borderlands more than everywhere else, there is a concrete need for a dialogue between different words, so to say, politics, academics, civil society, maybe also economics, for me, working in the cross-border cooperation since a long time, this is also what we try to do. This is why also I like that much working with Berthe, because we try to combine the academics and the students and the practitioners, but it goes beyond also with the civil society broader than the students, and with the economic world, etc. And I don't think we will find now in this roundtable the perfect recipe for organizing it or doing it better than we did, but maybe each of you have one ingredient that we could add in order to try to have a recipe again.
Yeah, I think you are the best example in your institute, and my ingredient would be to take this example, maybe transpose it to other border regions, not only in Europe but also across the Atlantic.
Yeah, and I would follow that and say, I think an organization whose day job and sole purpose it is to promote that cross-border cooperation, because otherwise you can have good intentions, and I'm going to completely contradict what I said earlier. You can have good relations, you can know who to call, but it's sort of the side of your desk, the relationships become very difficult to maintain. So if you have an institute that's dedicated to bringing all of those different sectors together in an intentional way.
And what I learned from your example yesterday is also to include the economic world also, which is a little bit more difficult maybe in European context, because it's not normal to make administration, states, and economic work together. But yeah, I think it's also something we can work on. Emmanuel?
I think the whole issue of border management has been quite very interesting. As the people who live in borderlands are not part of the policy process, and very often the minorities, especially in large states like Canada or the US, or Brazil, or India, or China. If you look at all these minority populations that live at the reach of the states, it's interesting to see that at the same time the policies are not obviously designed to address their questions. And so in North America, obviously, it's a little bit slightly different. There are some regions that actually manage to work very well. I think that where Laurie and I are located is kind of an exception. However, because when you compare with the Great Lakes, or even the Atlantic provinces that are much smaller, and yet when you look at the kind of policy innovations that come out of the partnerships in those parts of the provinces and states, it's much less productive, it's much less ambitious than what has happened in British Columbia. So there is a very specific context, I think, to the Cascadia corridor, which is kind of interesting. But the point I'm making is this, is that number one, border people are ignored. In Europe, it's 160 million people. It's about 40% of the land. And one day, probably next year, the big lab data is going to be able to tell you how many people it is across the world. But already the estimates that we have is that it's going to be less than in Europe, because in Europe, 36% of the population is very high, but you have massive amount of lands because the states are so small. But across the world, it could still be almost 1 billion people that have no say. And the size of the land is also quite vast, because entire provinces, for instance, in India, in Brazil, in China, are not part of the policy. They do exist, but they are people are minorities, they're indigenous, they are of different religion. Think about, and I can't go in details, but you have all this, and so it could be 20% of the land and the population worldwide, which is massive. They have no say. And so states need to work on border management and learn to manage their borderlands better, but also to integrate that diversity, that cosmopolitanism that they have in their own social fabric much better. And I think it's a huge challenge.
So I think you have asked for recently, I will just use 2 words. More narratives.
I just wanted to know if there is now, after this quite good conclusion from Frédéric, if you have some questions here in the audience or online. Yes, there is one, please.
I have a question for this company. There was a very beginning of the original concept of borders and security, and how borders can sort of act as shield from external threats, especially for terrorist attacks. So I was 29 years old when 9/11 happened, but from what I've heard and read, the airport was drastically transformed after 9/11. And so since you're sort of representing the United States, like everyone's representing a different country here, I wanted to ask you, are borders and airports or entry points that important for states when the terrorist attacks are actually committed by citizens? And
yeah, I mean, you sort of just reinforced my point of, do borders make us safer? Have they made us safer? I mean, certainly in regards to drug trafficking and terrorist attacks, they're great examples where we can say, no. I mean, maybe they have dissuaded some things from happening, but they certainly have not solved. So I think, and thank you for bringing up airports, because I always tend to be focused kind of on the land border environment, but airports and air travel are increasingly an important component of border policy, and actually where we find a lot of innovation happening in terms of.
Yes, please.
Just to check on this, and how this actually take where you have access and but don't you think that we didn't have borders, for example, if anyone who spent the last 20 years in that borders thing in that and from New York, we're not being people, wouldn't have more kind of.
So that's also sort of the filtering mechanism. If you have better gun control in the United States, would it matter if you stopped the gun from entering at the border or stopping somebody from, pulling it out in a movie theater? I think the point of control doesn't have to be the border; it can be internal as well. Because it's effective.
Yeah, another question here, please.
So we touched on it kind of earlier. We were talking about how you don't have to share a language to be able to cooperate across borders. Do you think that, especially considering how in the US, the Canadians were to be a lot more polite than the US towards the South? It's a lot, it's a lot more open, it's a lot less barbed wire, I'll say. So do you think the US and regular Americans benefit from a system where both of the borders are treated with the same kind of system, and do you think both of those are unique situations? Also, kind of a slightly EU the way they treat the borders?
Well, your question is a very good one, because on paper, the U.S. treats the Mexican border and the Canadian border in the same policy framework. They don't look the same. But for example, during the pandemic, there was a policy completely written for the southern border that said people could not claim asylum because of health precautions. This lasted for 2 years. Now that same policy was applied to the Canada-U.S. border to make things even, but not very many people are crossing from Canada to the U.S. So, on paper, there's sort of this policy goal of treating them the same. I think we could talk for hours about the complicated nature of trying to do that. And I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I think to a certain extent, the narrative around undocumented immigration is so strong on the southern border that it really precludes a lot of information and intelligence sharing that we could have, because so much of the money and so much of the political focus is about preventing undocumented immigration. But the flip side of that is, the Mexican government is not necessarily a government that's easy to collaborate with or to share intelligence with. There is a lot of vulnerabilities there. So I don't even know if I could say if we would benefit from that, because it feels like such a complicated situation on both borders. We can certainly learn a lot about what's not working and what's working hard. I don't know if there's any here.
Maybe wants to this.
So just to add to what Lori said, I think I fully confirm this. There is no doubt that the US is trying to keep both borders the same, but I would encourage you to just cross them and get a science. And you could even pick up your time. So when it's not too busy on the US and Mexico, for instance, so you go at, let's say, 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. Right? When it's not too busy, you take 1 hour. San Diego, you go either way, you can just cross the border, and you do the same experience between Vancouver and Seattle. So on the Vancouver-Seattle side, you'll take 2 minutes. On the Mexican side, you have absolutely no idea how long. And I would say, especially if you drive the car, if you go walking the Canadian and the US side might be a bit surprised because it's in the middle of nowhere. But but the border itself is very different for simple reasons in both those places, right? On the US, Mexico, take 1 hour. Crossing, you have fencing. Whereas in the Canada side, US side, you do not have fencing now. And it's much more militarized as well. So it doesn't need the same. And I think, you can't just cross the border and feel it's the same policy. You cross the border and how can it be the same policy?
And maybe if I can add one quick concrete example. So Canada and the US have a expedited traveler program where you get through security vetting and you can cross much more quickly. And that's a joint program administered by both governments, where when you apply to that program, you actually interview with a Canadian border officer, and then you go this way and there's the US border officer, and they are sitting there together deciding if you can pass that security clearance, and you use it both directions. The US has the same program on the Mexican border, but it's only for entry into the US because it is not a collaborative or cooperative program with the Mexican government, so you could move in both directions. And there's a lot of obvious to that kind of trust relationship and get intelligence.
Can I just add on? Because one of the CEPA students, and I just remember when we had one of our first classes here in the château, and I asked you, have you already crossed the border to Quelle? And you said, yes, we did. And then I said, so what was your experience? Expecting that they would say, yeah, it's an open border, and it was all nice here without borders. And I said, well, it's actually not really. It's like the same as when we cross the United States to with all these blocks, the trucks cannot go, and there are all the signs, and everything seems to be blocked. And I said, yes, because they're doing road works on the Cape Bridge. But this is so important because it's true for like 6 months, the bridge was blocked that way. And for you as American, you said, oh yeah, it's illegal. It's just an exceptional situation. So I think what Emmanuel said is really important. There are the rules, and then there is also the experience when you cross the border, and when we have crossed that border at Tijuana together. I mean, it's when you come from Europe, this is really an experience. And when you cross when you cross the border from Vancouver to Victoria, it's not the same experience at all. It's important. Yeah.
I can't remember the name, but there is a biker wrote novels on all kinds of things, and he decided once to ride Canada-US border line on his mobile, and he did the same on the US Mexico. And so it's one book with, I think, 24 chapters, and he basically described his speed going back and forth continually. He nearly lost his life a couple of times on the US Mexico side for many reasons, but one of the cases that I remember is that traffickers identified him as kind of a weirdo, trying to go in areas where that was just basically for them. And he got really, really scared. And so he had to hide for a couple of days before he took the road. So, you know, on the Canada-US side, you're across the prairies, cattle, and then sometimes there are trucks, and you have trains that stop you because they're crossing the road, you know, things like this. And the trains are like, they're there for 3 hours because they have so many cars. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you know, it's very peaceful. Even in the large urban areas, there is no such things that people, and yet there is trafficking. And there is not that related sense of violence that you can see when you're on the list. And I think his book, I might find it because I know a copy, is really interesting because it's the cultural experience, right? It's like, okay, somebody wanted to hike across, you know, 5 provinces and just walk for a few thousand kilometers. You probably have a similar experience on a road hike, because you just have a helmet, you drive in cars, find different roads to cross and see how it works. Quite interesting. It answers your question. Really like it. One is diverse, the other one is.
You have also one contribution online, but it's in French, so I will read it in French. I think this is the best for me. Un pluralisme juridique aux frontières, permettre davantage d'autodétermination juridique au profit des borderlanders, est-il souhaitable ou envisageable pour surmonter les effets frontières? Well, it's also very good, but a very long question. I don't know if it will be our last question. But do you want? Yeah. Okay.
Un pluralisme aux frontières, certainement qu'effectivement c'est une des réponses, mais ça va dans le sens de la coopération, de la collaboration, etc. Les frontières sont naturellement des zones de friction de droit, puisque ce sont des zones de délimitation des souverainetés nationales, et que le droit est assis sur le territoire. Donc le pluralisme, mais après, il faut voir comment on organise ce pluralisme. Là. Et on peut trouver des moyens, on a un peu exploré hier aussi, c'est-à-dire la reconnaissance mutuelle, est un moyen de faire qu'on élimine le frottement tout en gardant de droits différents. On peut aller vers l'harmonisation par terme, c'est-à-dire de n'avoir qu'un seul droit qui permet de régler un problème. C'est au fond trouver à la frontière des espèces de boîtes de dialogue qui vont permettre à deux normes de parler et de voir jusqu'où est-ce qu'on peut les appliquer, jusqu'où il faut finalement une solution tierce, une espèce de tiers droit, jusqu'où il faut juste savoir quel est connaître qu'est-ce qui se passe de l'autre côté de la frontière pour arriver à ce on évoquait le scriptatif, etc. C'est souvent cette boîte de dialogue en fait, qui manque à la frontière et qu'on a besoin de construire si tu veux une volonté.
Dialogue, trust, and political will. Maybe is a good conclusion for this roundtable. We are running a little bit out of time, so I will close the discussion here. And I wanted to very warmly thank our four experts and also very warmly thank you in the audience online and on site for your participation, active in your questions. Thank you so much. And I think we deserve a break.
We deserve a break.
Thank you.